From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know.
It's long been acknowledged, folks, in both the U.S. and abroad, that the wealthy and the well-connected get away with more than the average person. Laws in theory apply to everyone, yet in practice we see that members of society's upper echelons often escape the consequences of their crimes. This is a two-part series, and in this two-part series, we're diving deep into a story we mentioned in an earlier listener mail series. It's the story of tobacco heiress Doris Duke, who on October 7th, 1966, fatally struck her employee, Eduardo Torella, with a motor vehicle in what she initially claimed was an accident. And that's just scraping the surface of this lurid tale. Today, we are uncovering the real series of events, and good news, we're not diving in alone. We are joined by the world's preeminent expert on the Doris Duke case, the award-winning journalist, screenwriter, and author, Peter Lance, who earlier this year published new evidence that profoundly challenges the official narrative. Peter, thank you so much for joining us on air today.
Peter.
Great to be with you guys. I heard your first initiation of this story, and I was thrilled that you wanted to come back and do a back-to-back episode. So let's get into it.
Yeah, don't bury the lead there. This is going to be part one of a two-parter, with the first part largely dealing with some of the background and some of your original research into this case, and then part two digging into sort of bringing it up to the present and the new information that's been uncovered. So yeah, let's dive right in.
Would it be okay, just for the purposes of people who maybe didn't hear our listener mail segment or just are unaware of this, maybe set the scene with who Doris Duke is? Just let's set up who these characters are and maybe the time.
Okay, in 1966, Doris Duke was the richest woman in America, third richest in the world after Queen Elizabeth and Queen Juliana of the Netherlands. She was the fabulously wealthy heiress to American Tobacco Company, which produced Lucky Strike cigarettes, Alcoa Aluminum, and Duke Power, which is now called Duke Energy. She was, as a young little girl, really, I think at the age of 12, she inherited a massive fortune from her father, who on his deathbed said, "Trust no one, Doris." And as a result, she was notoriously paranoid. Over the years, she became notoriously jealous, with a violent temper, and she had four estates and a Park Avenue apartment. Duke Farms in New Jersey, 2,500 acres. Rough Point in Newport, Rhode Island, the scene of the crime in this case. Falcon Lair in Beverly Hills, Benedict Canyon, which is the old Rudolph Valentino estate, and Shangri-La in Honolulu, Diamond Head, which is a Islamic-themed estate. So she was incredibly powerful, incredibly wealthy. And for years, 7 years prior to this incident, in the fall of 1966, Eduardo Torella was her principal art curator and designer. He had residences in all of her estates. She never bought a work of art without consulting him. They traveled all over the world. He was her constant companion, happened to be gay. I did not know this when I first started to look into the story, but he was a war hero. He won the Bronze Star in the Battle of the Bulge. And he was an incredible Renaissance man. He started as a song and dance man, ended up designing hats, designing clothing, went to Beverly Hills, Saks Fifth Avenue, and then eventually got into movie design and became very close to Sharon Tate, Kim Novak, Liz Taylor, Richard Burton. And he was literally on the precipice of a new career at the age of 42 when, minutes after he told Doris he was leaving her, she crushed him to death under the wheels of a 2-ton Dodge Polaris station wagon.
Now, Peter, I mean, the initial thing that one might think is he's leaving me. He was her lover, that there was some, chemistry going on in that apartment, but it was very clear that he was gay. Was he closeted gay? Was there a presumption that he was her lover? Did she think of him that way, or was this just literally like an abandonment issue kind of thing?
Good question. Well, he was very decidedly gay. He had a partner, Edmund Cara, who was a very prominent sculptor on the West Coast. In fact, Doris had been out to visit them. They had a place up by Big Sur as well as in L.A. She hired Edmund. She knew Edmund. She was not jealous of him, but she had a voracious sexual appetite for men and women. And she, after my Vanity Fair piece ran, I was contacted by a gentleman who was a big game hunter in the Himalayas, and incredible guy, 90 years old, sounded on the phone like he was 60. And he told me that he was her lover after this happened for like 7 months in Hawaii. And that in Pillow Talk one night, he asked her about this. And she basically said, and he said, I'll never forget this. He got what was coming to him. Nobody 2 times me. That was a direct quote from him. So we don't know what was in her head, how much she may have coveted Eduardo, who was handsome, had movie star looks, but anyway, to answer your question, we don't really know what her motive was except possession. I'll tell you briefly, her common law husband, Joseph Armand Castro, was a brilliant jazz pianist and band leader. They were together for almost 10 years, common law. And 2 years before this happened, one night, and they had a tumultuous booze and barbiturates-fueled relationship, like a roller coaster for many years. One night, she's playing a little something on the jazz piano in Falcon Lair, and he made a crack, and she got a butcher knife and slashed his arm 150 stitches for just a little comment about her piano playing. And she covered that one up. He never went to the hospital, never went to the police, and she got away with that. So that'll give you an idea of her sense of power and entitlement when it led up to this event.
So clearly, just with that understanding of maybe Doris's character a bit, that she could do something like that and not get in trouble with it, it kind of casts light on the way, at least I personally think about this incident, right, with Eduardo. How was it viewed when this all went down initially? What was the official story of what occurred?
So what happened was that Doris and Eduardo were driving out of the estate. He had asked her to rent a station wagon, ostensibly to pick up some artwork and move it down to his mother's house in New Jersey. Didn't want to tell her right away that he was leaving her. In fact, he'd been warned, all of his friends, don't do it by phone. He literally he had just done a movie with Taylor and Burton called The Sandpiper. He made the equivalent, I think, of $348,000 the year before in modern dollars. He had 20 more years of career ahead of him. He was on fire. And he did the next film he did, Sharon Tate was in, called Don't Make Waves. They were very close, ironically. So anyway, she wanted to pick up this thing called the Reliquary of Saint Ursula, which is a very interesting thing. It's a statue of a woman, a bust of a woman who was a saint, a famous saint in the Middle Ages, with a relic. It's a kind of a Catholic thing, they revere bones of saints. We do. I used to be a Catholic anyway, and so they were going to get this reliquary that she'd actually bought a year before it had been restored, and they were going out to pick it up at the antique store in town so that Eduardo could give it his imprimatur and nihil obstat, this is worthy of getting, okay? And so literally minutes before, and I interviewed a servant at the place, said they got into a wicked fight, which is classic Newport for a big fight. So they get into this wagon. Eduardo is driving out of the estate. Her estate, Rough Point, had these massive iron gates. They were 12 feet tall, wrought iron. Each one was 7 feet wide. They were freely swinging, but they had a stop at the bottom that kept them so that they would not swing outward. They would swing inward. So he pulls the wagon. He's in the driver's seat. She's in the shotgun seat. And they pull it up to 15 feet before the gate. Plenty of room for him to get out. So he got out of the vehicle, and then they kept it wrapped with a chain during the day. He just didn't even get a chance to unravel the chain when she basically committed 4 intentional acts. She slid over behind the wheel. She then released the parking brake by hand, and this is a very important element. She then put it into gear. It was a on-the-wheel gear shift. She shifted from park to drive, and then she slammed down on the accelerator with such force that it caused tire width gouge marks in the gravel driveway behind her. And then he hears the noise, and he turns, and she just goes at him. Now, I might as well tell you what really happened, and then we can tell what they said happened. It's better this way, I think, to tell you the truth. So what happened was he went up on the hood of the car, which is something, it's a phenomena that people do when their car is approaching to save their lives. It's like a lizard brain instinct if you can't go left or right. So he literally jumped up on the hood of the car. He's staring at her through the windshield, holding on. He broke his right hip, but he was otherwise alive and well. She then burst through the gates. Now, here's the key. There are two more intentional acts after this. She bursts through the gates, and then suddenly, for unknown reasons, she taps the brakes. The car decelerates and comes to a slight skid of a stop. He rolls off onto Bellevue Avenue, the Millionaire's Row, in front of her estate, 80-foot wide street. And he's hurt. He's calling out. And she decides, how many moments did she, take? We don't know. But within short order, she decided to commit, and she just drove over him and dragged him across Bellevue Avenue. The car mounted a curb, knocked down 20 feet of post and rail fence, and smashed against a tree, literally so that it was parallel to Rough Point across the street. And he was dead under the rear axle. She was the only living witness. The police essentially wrapped it up in 96 hours with her as the only witness, and we can get into the details of the cover-up later on. And basically, they just declared it an unfortunate accident, despite the fact, as I later found, the chief accident investigator for the department, Sergeant Fred Newton, who later became chief, determined within moments after he began investigating after the crash that she committed intent to kill homicide. But because they were going to cut her a deal and what I call a murderous quid pro quo and let her off for these charges, he had to alter the official police report, which ultimately I got. It was like the great white whale of the Ark of the Covenant of my investigation. But anyway, that's essentially what happened. But they claimed falsely she crushed him against the gates. Okay, that was the claim. She claimed in a very short interview, the only interview she did was like 4 questions, 5 answers in her bedroom 3 days after the incident took place. She said, he got out. We had done this 100 times before. Also untrue. I'll tell you why. And I slid behind the wheel, and suddenly I was on him, as if like the car took over like Christine in a Stephen King novel with a life of its own, and just drove forward, and then I was on him like that. That was it. On the basis of that, but in order for that to fly, he had to have been crushed against the gate. But as we'll see when we get into this later, when I got forensic evidence, autopsy reports, pictures of the gates, I found 2 amazing photographers and their progeny who helped to get me these photographs that have been missing for years. We'll see that essentially there was no blood on the gates. There was no damage to the gates. There are photographs of the gates with Sergeant Newton in the foreground, like moments after it happened, working the scene. There's no blood. There's no trail of blood. But the first officer on the scene, Edward Angel, who I'll talk about, found blood and skin in the middle of Bellevue Avenue, exactly where Eduardo would have been when she, ran over him. So that essentially, I had a major accident investigator named Harm Jansen, who works for a principal company in El Segundo, California, that does this kind of work. And he just was so intrigued. He did probably $10,000 of free research. And he said to me, look, if it had been a single sequence events, he would have lived. I said, what's that? A single sequence events. He goes up on the hood. She blows through the gates, keeps on going. He bounces off. There was nothing to impale him on the other side of the street. He would have lived with a broken hip. A double sequence events is what happened. She tapped the brakes, then he rolled off, and then she dragged him to his death. All the injuries to his body fatal injuries are upper body, and all the damage to the gate is lower gate, and none of it suggests anything like he was crushed against the gates.
This is something that really stood out to me reading your work, especially that moment you just described that doesn't match her official explanation. A foot slipping and hitting the wrong pedal, maybe that happens once, but the idea that there's the pause and then there's more acceleration, I think, is in no small part damning. And you made a fantastic point that I found pretty disturbing, which was about how not just contemporary reports and law enforcement, but even later biographers seem to consciously downplay or ignore this death. And there's this really disquieting thing you point out, which is that very shortly after the death, Doris Duke begins making massive amounts of donations to the city of Newport. And just to openly connect the dots for our audience here, I feel like I'm asking an obvious question, but Peter, what makes these donations so suspicious?
Well, first of all, she gave $10,000, and you can multiply that by 8 to get the current dollar figure. Okay, so like effectively $80,000 to Newport Hospital. Why did she do that? Well, you're not going to believe this, but it's true. The county medical examiner, Philip C. McAllister, who was an Irish immigrant, a war veteran, a wonderful man who happened to be my family doctor. Okay, this is how small a town Newport is. Had no idea. I had no idea that he did this. He literally, the night of, it was his job to determine the cause of death. He allowed himself to go on her payroll. And so he stuck her in a room. He locked her away at Newport Hospital in a private room and near the ICU so that state investigators who were duty bound to interview anyone behind the wheel in a vehicular homicide could not get to her. In fact, they didn't get to her until that interview in the bedroom I told you about a few days later, and they weren't even told when it was going to happen. They got there at the very end, and Louis Perotti, one of the surviving investigators, told me, he's 86, the fix was in by the time we got there. So, that's that part of the story. And so then she had Newport, if you've been to Newport at all, Millionaires Row, Bellevue Avenue, this incredible street, behind it on the water side is the thing called the Cliff Walk. There's a beautiful pedestrian walkway. It's one of the top tourist attractions in New England. And for years, Doris had tried to block it off with chain link fences. She'd been in litigation with the city of Newport because she was so paranoid. She had vicious dogs in her estate that were constantly mauling people. Okay. And so within I don't know how many days, I think 8 days after this event, she gave the equivalent of several $100,000 to restore the Cliff Walk. So I call it a murderous quid pro quo. She basically bought her way out of murder charges. The police chief, Joe Radissi, who we can talk about later, retired to Florida, bought 2 condos and a new building, even though his last salary was $7,000 a year. The lieutenant who interviewed her in the bedroom was promoted to chief over the captain of detectives. Another guy at present was promoted to sergeant. Even Fred Newton was promoted to lieutenant, although I believe he was absolutely honest about his appraisal of what happened. And eventually he became chief. But everybody got sort of taken care of in the food chain in Newport, Rhode Island, and the upper echelons of law enforcement. And Doris just skated. And however, and this is, you can prompt us with a question, the family of Eduardo, he was the youngest of 9 children in this wonderfully middle-class Italian-American family in Dover, New Jersey. And his 8 brothers and 5 sisters and 3 brothers asked Doris to settle with them for his wrongful death. You can imagine, and why not? So they asked for $600,000. Multiply that time 8. She refused. They then went down to $200,000. She refused. This is at a time when she was making $1 million a week in interest on her money. She could stand in the corner of her room for a week, do nothing, and be $1 million richer. And she refused, forcing them to file a wrongful death case in Providence 5 years later, after which she had restored a number of more than 70 colonial-era houses that saved Newport from bankruptcy after the Navy had begun to pull out. Newport was on the verge of bankruptcy, and Doris comes in, moves these colonial houses around to the point where Amistad was shot in Newport. That's how beautiful this town is in the colonial era that she was responsible for. And by the time the wrongful death trial happens, she's found civilly liable for his death. And guess what? When they get to the damage phase, how much she owes his family? $75,000 was the total. And after the lawyers took their cut, each brother and sister got $5,620 for the death of this remarkable man.
Well, he was a remarkable man. I mean, you're talking about how he was going kind of spreading his own wings, kind of going his own way. He was going to become a big consultant in Hollywood in the motion picture industry. He was making a lot of money on his own outside of Doris and that relationship. And I think you mentioned in the Vanity Fair piece, anyway, that calculation from his family was based on how much money he would have continued to generate during his life. So it wasn't even like a cash grab or some kind of like greedy thing at all.
Yeah, exactly. Although here's here's a very interesting thing. I'm jumping ahead, guys, but Doris, you used the term hagiography in your last broadcast, which is a term I found that it was very appropriate, which is the reverence of certain figures as if they're religious figures. Hagiography, right? You clean up after somebody after whatever evil they've wrought in their lives, and suddenly they're up on Mount Olympus. Well, Doris, during her lifetime, she was such a controversial and troubled figure. She hired minions. She had private investigators, lawyers, press flacks that would go in and clean up after her. Example, the photograph that was in the Daily News the next day, which shows the underside of the vehicle, was missing from the archives of the Newport Daily News when I went to find it. That one negative was missing for reasons we can discuss later. The entire transcript of the wrongful death trial, missing from Rhode Island Judicial Archives. The only way I was able to piece together the trial was from press clippings and from the appellate record, which I was able to get. But the actual transcript with the photographs of the tire gouge marks and all that other stuff, gone. So she would regularly have these people go and just remove things and literally, get away with murder. In the case of Joe Castro, get away with intent to kill murder.